At 55, Hollis Vardaman had reached the point in life when a man could finally stand still long enough to see what 30 years of work had become. Vardaman's Spur Ranch spread across the open country north of Canadian Texas. Hollis had begun with leased pasture, 2 weathered horse trailers, and a willingness to work longer than anyone who hired him. Now he was a respected horse breeder and ranch owner known for reliable ranch horses trusted by working families. His wife, Ardith Bell Vardaman, 53, had spent most of her adult life as the ranch bookkeeper and office manager, keeping contracts, breeding records, and payroll. Their only son, Merritt Vardaman, 28, worked as a horse trainer and sales coordinator on the ranch. Hollis had been quietly preparing Merritt to take over. Beside them was Brannon Kersey, 59, the ranch manager who had worked with Hollis for nearly 2 decades and knew the property intimately. Hollis trusted Brannon almost as much as he trusted his own son. That spring, the ranch had its strongest sales season in years. One of their young stallions brought an exceptional price, and Hollis finally told Ardith he might step back within a few years. At a small dinner in the ranch house, Hollis lifted his glass and said that the best thing he had built was not the barns or the herd. It was something his son could carry forward. Merritt lowered his eyes for a moment, then smiled. The next morning, Hollis received a call from a buyer in New Mexico asking about transfer papers for a bay gelding named Red Mesa Flint. Hollis frowned. Flint was not supposed to have been sold. He walked from the office to the training barn, crossed the concrete aisle, and stopped at an empty stall. He checked another stall. Empty. He called Merritt. No answer. Then he called Brannon. No answer there either. By noon, Ardith had pulled sales records, bank statements, transport invoices, and registration transfers. The truth came in pieces. Merritt and Brannon had been building a separate horse resale venture without Hollis. They planned to buy unfinished horses, train them quickly, and resell them. Hollis had rejected the idea months earlier because it depended on borrowed money and fast turnover. Merritt had pretended to agree. Instead, he and Brannon began using ranch assets to finance it. First, they sold horses Hollis was unlikely to notice immediately. Then they used proceeds from legitimate ranch sales. When the new venture began losing money, they sold more. Eventually, they pledged equipment and tied new obligations to the ranch. Merritt kept believing one successful sale would repair everything before his father found out. It never came. Brannon disappeared before Hollis could confront him. Merritt stayed. Father and son stood in the ranch office. Hollis did not shout. He asked one question. "Why didn't you ask me?" Merritt tried to explain that he wanted to prove he could build something of his own. Hollis looked at the empty stalls beyond the office window. "You were going to inherit something of your own," he said. "You just couldn't wait for it." For months, Hollis fought to save Vardaman Spur Ranch. Ardith worked beside him, sorting obligations they had never known existed. They sold spare trailers, a newer pickup, tack, equipment, and horses they had planned to keep for years. Hollis met lenders while still working the ranch before sunrise. Every sale bought too little time. The outside venture had failed at exactly the wrong moment, and the ranch already carried improvement debt. A portion of pasture went first, then the main training barn and adjoining acreage were included in a larger sale. Finally, Hollis accepted what he had refused to say aloud. Saving the name could destroy what remained of his family's finances. Vardaman Spur Ranch was sold. On the final evening, Hollis walked through the training barn alone. Empty stalls stood where horses had once leaned over the doors at feeding time. Near the office, faint pencil marks still climbed one doorframe, each one labeled from the years when Merritt had been a boy growing up inside that barn. Hollis rested his fingers on the highest mark. From outside, Ardith called softly, "Hollis, it's time." He switched off the barn lights and closed the door. Merritt left the panhandle and took work with a horse transport company farther west. Hollis did not ask where. Ardith knew, but she respected the silence between them. Hollis and Ardith moved into a modest rental outside Canadian, while the last accounts were settled. For the first time in decades, Hollis woke without animals waiting for him. He lasted less than 3 months. With what remained after the liquidation, he found a neglected property farther north toward the broken country near the Canadian River. It had a small house, an aging barn, tired fences, and enough grass to support a modest operation if managed carefully. The price was low for one reason: water. The old well produced, but slowly. The previous owner had relied on a simple system that no longer reached the far pastures reliably. A contractor gave Hollis an estimate for a modern replacement. Hollis folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He could afford the land or the water system, but not both. He bought the land. Hollis began again with a few horses owned by clients who still trusted his hands, 2 broodmares he had managed to keep, and repair work for neighboring ranches. Ardith, still a bookkeeper by trade, took part-time accounting work in town and handled the new ranch records at night. They named the place Dryline Ranch because Hollis no longer wanted a grand name. One Saturday, he drove to an estate auction at an old cattle property being converted to a different operation. Buyers crowded around newer equipment. Hollis wandered to the far end of the yard, where the things nobody wanted had been lined up near a scrap pile. There were dented steel stock tanks, old water storage tanks, lengths of pipe, float valves, fittings, trough frames, and 2 pumps with sun-faded housings. Rust stained several tanks. One had a patched seam. Hollis spent nearly an hour inspecting them. He tapped the steel, checked old welds, and measured outlets. The auctioneer eventually reached the pile and received almost no interest. A scrap buyer made a low offer. Hollis raised his hand. By the end of the afternoon, he owned nearly all of it. Ardith stared at the trailers when he pulled into Dryline Ranch. "Tell me you didn't spend our emergency money on rust," she said. Hollis climbed down from the truck. "Not all of it." Ardith closed her eyes. Hollis did not pretend the equipment was good simply because it was cheap. Anything unsafe or too badly corroded went to scrap. He tested the equipment, replaced critical fittings, re-welded sound steel, and discarded unsafe pieces. Then he stopped thinking of the pieces as a collection of old equipment and began thinking of them as parts of a network. Dryline Ranch had gentle changes in elevation that the previous system barely used. Hollis placed the strongest storage tank on higher ground. Lower tanks became intermediate reserves. Smaller troughs served individual paddocks, where gravity could move water. He let gravity work where it could not. He used a small pump. He installed shut-off valves so a leak in one branch would not drain everything else. He kept separate reserves instead of depending on one large tank. The result looked terrible. Different tanks sat across the ranch like forgotten machinery. But Hollis knew where every gallon was supposed to go. Neighbors began calling it the junkyard water system. Hollis did not care. He cared that distant paddocks had water, and that one failed line would not stop the others. He cared that the weak well could fill storage slowly through the night instead of being asked to meet peak demand all at once. Merritt returned on the cold afternoon without warning. Hollis saw the unfamiliar pickup first, then recognized his son when the door opened. Merritt looked older than 28 now. Ardith hugged him. Hollis stayed beside a half-repaired trough. Merritt walked the property with his father in silence. He saw the modest ranch and the scattered tanks. He stopped beside one with rust running down its side. "Dad, you're building a ranch out of junk." Hollis kept tightening a fitting. "Junk is what people call something after they stop needing it." Merritt looked across the pasture. "This isn't you." Hollis finally looked at him. "You mean it isn't what I had?" Merritt had no answer. He offered to stay for a few days and help. Hollis refused. Not cruelly, simply. Merritt had once been given responsibility because he was family. Hollis was no longer willing to confuse blood with trust. Merritt left before dark. Later that night, Hollis told Ardith she could call their son if she wanted. "I do," she said. "He's still my son. That doesn't make what he did disappear." Hollis said nothing. A week later, one of the old tanks developed a leak around a seam. Then a float valve stuck open and emptied another reserve overnight. A used pump failed. The neighbor who had joked about the system told Hollis he should finance something proper before the old equipment cost him more than new equipment would have. For one evening, Hollis wondered if pride had disguised itself as ingenuity. The failures taught Hollis something his old ranch never had. At Vardaman Spur, success had encouraged him to make everything bigger and more connected. One office controlled the books. One manager knew most operations. And one son was expected to inherit the future. Hollis had mistaken efficiency for strength. At Dryline Ranch, he began designing around the assumption that things would fail. He added isolation valves. He created overflow paths. He moved one reserve tank higher. He stopped using any old component merely because he owned it. If a piece could not be trusted, it left. The goal was to use remaining value intelligently. Over the next year, the ranch grew slowly. Hollis took more training horses. He added a few mares. Artists' careful books kept expansion tied to money they actually had. They borrowed little. Nothing looked impressive from the county road. But the ranch worked. Then the rains weakened. Spring passed with less moisture than usual. By early summer, the panhandle settled into the kind of heat that made metal painful to touch by noon. The drought tightened around the region week by week. Stock ponds shrank, grass lost color. Wells that had been reliable for years began producing more slowly. Ranchers hauled water and reduced stock. Dryline Ranch had no miracle. Its well weakened too. Hollis reduced outside horses and moved animals according to grass and water. Then, during the hottest stretch of the summer, the small pump serving the western branch stopped. Hollis found the far trough dropping faster than it could refill. Then, after dark, a main line split and one reserve tank began draining into the dry ground. Hollis reached it with a flashlight and found the water level falling fast. For several minutes he simply stood there, listening to water hiss through the break. Ardith arrived in the pickup with drinking water and tools. Hollis sat on the tailgate, exhausted. "I can't do this twice," he said. Ardith knew he was not talking about the pipe. Then Hollis stood, closed the isolation valve, and went back to work. Problems like these would have crippled his original setup. This time he shut a valve, isolated the damaged branch, opened a connection from a higher reserve, and let gravity feed the lower troughs while he worked on the pump. The system was ugly, patched, and imperfect, but it bent instead of breaking. Separate tanks bought time while the weak well replenished reserves overnight. When one section failed, the rest remained alive. Hollis still hauled some water during the worst week. He still sold 2 horses earlier than planned. Survival did not look like victory. It looked like having enough choices left to avoid disaster. Late that summer, a neighboring rancher named Dillard Swope, 62, a cow-calf operator who had teased Hollis about his collection of rusty tanks, pulled into the yard. His own well was struggling to keep up with demand at a remote pasture. He asked Hollis how the upper reserve fed the lower line without constant pumping. Hollis showed him. He explained the isolation valves and why several reserves gave him options when one branch failed. Dillard ran his hand over an old weld. "Still ugly," he said. Hollis smiled. "Water doesn't care." Other neighbors came later. Hollis never presented himself as an inventor. What surprised people was how deliberately he had assembled them from equipment they had dismissed. The value had never been in the rust. It was in knowing what remained useful, what needed replacing, and how the pieces could work together. Dryline Ranch made it through the summer. Not untouched, not rich, but alive. For Hollis, that was enough. Near the end of summer, Ardith handed Hollis an envelope forwarded from their old address. Brannon Kersey had written it. The letter contained an apology and an explanation Hollis did not need. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. Brannon had chosen distance. Whatever remorse he carried would have to remain his own. Merritt came back after the first cool front of autumn. This time he carried work gloves and one duffel bag. He found Hollis beside the barn repairing a valve assembly. Merritt finally said, "I destroyed what you were going to give me." Hollis set down the wrench. "You helped destroy the ranch I built." Merritt nodded. He did not defend himself. He admitted that blaming Brannon had become another way of avoiding his own choice. He had signed papers, sold horses, and lied. "I thought if I fixed it before you found out, it wouldn't count as betrayal." Hollis looked at him for a long time. "That's not how trust works," Merritt swallowed. "I know." He did not ask for forgiveness or a share of the ranch. He asked for work. Hollis glanced toward a steel tank near the barn. A thin line of water was running from a fitting and darkening the dirt beneath it. He opened his toolbox, took out a wrench, and held it toward his son. "Start with that leaking tank." Merritt accepted it. He knelt beside the tank and began. Merritt stayed. At first he was treated like any hired hand. He repaired fences, cleaned stalls, checked troughs, moved hay, exercised horses, and recorded every expense Ardith asked him to record. Hollis did not give him passwords, contracts, or authority because he had apologized. Months passed. Trust returned in increments too small to celebrate. One morning, Hollis asked Merritt to handle a client horse alone. Eventually, they drove together to an auction, where Merritt stopped beside discarded pipe. "You looking at that?" Hollis asked. Merritt shook his head. "Just wondering what you see." Hollis looked at the pipe, then at his son. "Depends what's left in it." Years earlier, Hollis had believed inheritance meant handing a finished thing from one generation to the next. Dryline Ranch taught him something harder. A person could inherit land without earning trust, or lose land without losing the ability to build. And something damaged did not become valuable merely because you wanted it to be. You had to inspect it honestly. Keep what was sound, replace what was dangerous. Repair what could hold, let go of what could not. On a clear evening after the drought had broken, Hollis and Merritt stood beside the first steel tank Hollis had bought at the estate auction. Its exterior still carried brown streaks of rust, though the repaired seams held and the water inside reflected the pale Texas sky. Merritt tapped the side with his knuckles. "You ever going to replace this thing?" Hollis looked into the water. When it stops being useful, across the ranch, horses moved quietly through recovering grass. The place was smaller than Vardaman Spur had ever been. There was no grand barn, expensive trailer line, or office full of awards. Beside him stood the son who had once expected everything and instead began with a leaking tank. Hollis had not forgotten what Merritt did. Forgiveness had not erased consequence, but neither had betrayal erased every good thing that might still be rebuilt. The old tanks had taught him that much. Rust showed something had survived. Not that nothing remained. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel. There are people, places, and even forgotten things all around us that may still hold more value than anyone can see at first glance. Sometimes the most meaningful second chances do not begin with something new. They begin when someone is willing to look carefully at what remains, tell the truth about the damage, and decide that what is still good is worth rebuilding.